G'day everyone, David Wilson again for Food for Thought at Zach's Place. Here we are, still in lockdown in Melbourne, about a third of the way through the 6-week lockdown, and wishing it could be different, but understanding that this is the way to get on top of things. Wish we could meet together at Zach's Place. I'm really missing that time that we gather in the little wooden chapel there in Yarra Junction, but until we can do that again, we'll keep on studying God's Word and seeing what it says for us today. And we've been going through James, and that's exactly where we're going to pick up today. But we've hit chapter 5, James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. And James is nearing the end of his instructions, his guidance to the scattered church, scattered throughout the Roman Empire, because of persecution and suffering that was going on, and they're involved in asking questions of how should we then live, and that's what we've entitled this particular sermon series, or this series of sharing from God's Word. When we come to James chapter 5 verses 1 to 6, and as usual, if you want to stop the video now and have a read of those verses, great verses, and then get back to me, that would be a good thing. So in James 5, 1 to 6, we observe that he addresses the problems of wealth and abuse by giving a warning to rich people. And he says, look, your wealth is going to let you down. It's not everything that you hoped it would be. Your wealth will be ruined, and you will be ruined along with it. Pretty stern words, especially for people who are trusting in wealth. I guess there's one thing that the COVID-19 stuff has done economically is help people realise that wealth is such an insecure commodity that it can be here today and gone tomorrow. And that's exactly what James is saying here in this chapter, in chapter 5. But more importantly than having a go at wealth and wealthy people, because that's not really where his concern is, he actually condemns the issues that lie behind the problem of wealth. And this is where it's especially relevant for us today. He says, look, you wealthy people, what you've done is you've stored up the wealth. You've stored up money. You haven't used it. You've withheld payment to people who deserve it, to the workers. You've underpaid them. You haven't paid them. You've withheld payment from the workers. You've lived in luxury and indulgence while committing these sins against people who are not wealthy. And he says you've condemned and murdered the righteous. Well, that's pretty heavy words. Remember, he's writing to followers of Jesus scattered around the world. He's writing to the church. And he's having a real heavy go at them as to what the sort of life that they're living. So reflecting on that, there would have been rich people in the audience that James was writing to. The church didn't exclude rich people. It certainly didn't exclude the poor and the needy, but it didn't exclude rich people, wealthy people either. And so there would have been rich people in the audience. And of course, whenever the church is really doing its job, it's going to have all sorts of people in it because the gospel is for everybody. And the gospel will attract people who have indeed condemned and murdered the righteous. The gospel will attract people who are living in luxury and indulgence, but have recognised there's a deep need within their lives, something's missing, and the gospel will attract them. And the gospel will attract people who have ripped other people off, who have withheld payment to their workers. Remember when Jesus was walking the earth, he attracted tax collectors to him, and tax collectors would fit into this category really well. But in Jesus, they found something or somebody that would give meaning to life and would help people understand what meaning is all about. Really important stuff. And so there would have been people like that in the church that James is writing to. And also there's another problem with wealth, and that is people who are not wealthy being envious of people who have got wealth. People who are not wealthy wishing that they were wealthy, and the not so rich can have some of that evil within them, wishing that they could be like them. And there certainly would have been some of those sort of people in the church as well. And so James is offering a condemnation of oppressive practices in the culture. He's saying, look, these ways of oppressing people are just not on. And one of the problems is that he's addressing them in the community of faith as well. You see, it's not the wealth that's the problem. It's the issues surrounding the wealth that James lists that are being spoken against. And in so doing, he aligns himself with much of what the Old Testament prophets were saying. This is exactly stuff out of the Old Testament prophecies of saying, Israel, you're abusing the poor by storing up stuff for yourself. You're oppressing others by indulging in this sort of stuff. And you're going to be let down from it, but also you're oppressing others who don't have this, and that's just not on. And so in writing like this, James is aligning himself with those Old Testament prophets. So this passage, far from being just having a go at wealthy people, is actually a protest against oppression. You see, God can't stand oppression in any of its forms. It's not only wealth that can be ill-gotten and used oppressively. These lessons and these warnings that James is giving to us here, these condemnations, they apply equally to power and to privilege as much as they do to wealth. See, anything that we have that others don't, we can use oppressively against those people, whether it be power or privilege or wealth. And that's really important to recognise. Also, in line with what James has been saying before about sins of omission, we need to realise that these condemnations that James is handing out need to be read alongside what he said about the sins of omission, and that is, if you're omitting to do good with your wealth, if you're omitting to do good with the power that you have and the privilege that you have, then you're oppressing people. You see, it's not only using your wealth and your power and your privilege against people that is oppressive, it's also refusing or neglecting to use what you have to assist those who are underprivileged, who are not wealthy, who don't experience the power that we have. Now that's very serious business. That's really serious. He's really getting at the problem of oppression within our society here, and he's saying this is just not on, and this mustn't be known within the church. And so when James says, so it is a sin for the person who knows to do what is good and doesn't do it, well, that needs to be applied to wealth and power and privilege as much as it does anything else. Pretty heavy passage, eh? So does this line up with Jesus? Does this line up with what Jesus lived and taught? Well, sure does. James not only aligns himself with Old Testament prophets, but he aligns himself with Jesus himself. Jesus spoke out clearly against oppression. He spoke out clearly against the problem of trusting in wealth and the need to, he taught the need to live by a different set of values and a different set of priorities. And he spoke the same way about privilege and power. If we go back to the Gospels and look at what Jesus was saying, we see he's saying the same sort of stuff. So yes, once again, James aligns himself exactly with Jesus' priorities. These things are oppressive, or they can be used oppressively, and they mustn't be known within the church. Jesus was saying that, the Old Testament prophets were saying that, and now James aligns himself with all of that. Serious teaching for us today to take seriously. And so, in application, so what? What do we do with all of that? What do we have today that we have attained unfairly or that we're using oppressively? Serious questions for us. This question digs deep into the into fair trade practices, for instance, and the spending of wealth in the gentrification of our cities. Where we gentrify a neighbourhood to the neglect of the poor within that neighbourhood, which pushes the poor out of that neighbourhood. Well, that's oppression. And we're using power and privilege and wealth against the poor people of our society. Gentrification is a serious problem all around the world, but even here in Australia, even here in Melbourne, the world's most livable city. But in some ways it became a livable city. For who? Well, for the privileged rather than the underprivileged. And in Melbourne becoming a U-Butte city, oftentimes people who used to feel a part of it have been pushed to the edges. Well, that's oppression. We need to beautify our cities. We need to beautify our neighbourhoods. We need to bring about shalom and well-being in our neighbourhoods without neglecting all of the people, without neglecting the poor within our neighbourhoods. And that's the sort of stuff that we need to be considering when we're looking at living in a great city like Melbourne. We also need to ask ourselves, what oppressive policies have we put in place? Or what oppressive policies have we not spoken out against? You see, when you know what to do that's good and you don't do it, well, that's a problem. That's oppressive. If we're allowing policies to go on without seeking to do something about it, especially as we have opportunity, without speaking into those issues. And we've got all sorts of oppressive policies in relation to refugees, in relation to homeless people, in relation to mental health issues, all sorts of oppressive policies that seem to undermine the rights of the underprivileged in our society. These are the sorts of things that I believe that James would be addressing today if he was talking directly to us. In fact, he is, isn't he? He's writing to us today and saying, you need to be serious about overcoming this oppression, exercising power and influencing and distributing wealth so that it's not detrimental to the poor in our communities, is what James would be saying. Those issues are serious all around us, whether it be the Black Lives Matter movement or environmental care, or what about media bias that uses its power to oppress the marginalised, or any of the other crises that our world faces right now. James teaches and cries out in strong words against any and every form of oppression. There are extremes that we can all point the finger at, but that doesn't excuse all of us from having a close look at our lives of privilege and doing whatever we can to move us closer to equity. It must start within the church, because the church is a community of the kingdom in the neighbourhood. And remembering that this applies to power and privilege as well as wealth is really important for us. So I reckon James has something strategic to say to us as a community of faith, seeking to live out the values and the priorities of Jesus, of love, in our neighbourhoods. May it be so. Thanks for listening. If you want to contact me, David Roach Wilson, Roach, David Roach Wilson @gmail.com. Have a great week.